Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our discussion about prospects for long-term growth and policy implications for developing economies. My name is Ayhan Köse. I am Acting Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions Practice Group here at the World Bank. I'm joined by three distinguished panelists. First, Marie Pangestu. She's our Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships here at the bank. Marie has extensive policymaking experience. She previously served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade and Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy. Second, we have Laura Alfaro. She's Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She too has deep policymaking experience. She previously served as Costa Rica's Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy. Last but not the least, we have Mesut Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development. Mesut devoted his career driving economic policy initiatives at IMF and the World Bank and other institutions. As a World Bank Vice President in the late 1990s, he led the heavily indebted poor countries HIPC debt relief initiative for the world's poorest nations. Thank you for being with us today, Marie, Laura, and Mesut. We have a large audience from across the world via Facebook, YouTube, and World Bank Live. Please do post your questions online, and we will respond towards the end of the session. As we all know, the COVID-19 crisis arrived at a moment of particular weakness for emerging market and developing economies. Even before the crisis, potential growth in these economies was already slowing. In 3 quarters of emerging market and developing economies, investment growth rates had fallen below averages seen in the 2000s. Debt levels in many of these economies were at dangerously high levels. The pandemic is likely to magnify these trends. It has already dealt a major setback to growth prospects in the coming years by depressing investment, by increasing unemployment, by disrupting education and dampening consumer spending. Quite simply, the scars of the pandemic will be long-lasting. That's the topic of today, how we can reverse these scars associated with the pandemic. We have a chapter on this issue with the question, is global economy headed for a decade of disappointments in our latest Global Economy Prospects report? The report suggests the global economy will grow again in 2021, emerging from the most severe recession we have experienced since the Second World War. But this is hardly a recovery. Global economic output is expected to expand 4% this year, but it will remain more than 5% below where it would have been had the 2020 global recession not happened. Moreover, growth in the next few years is likely to be subdued, limiting the spread of the virus, providing relief for vulnerable populations, and deploying vaccines effectively must, of course, be the immediate priorities for policymakers. But they will also need to employ substantial reforms to avoid a lost decade. What does this lost decade mean? Let me motivate our conversation with some results we reported in the global economic prospects. The first result was that output losses the global economy experienced last year will be mostly permanent. In fact, our calculations indicate that cumulatively during the 2020-2025, these output losses will amount to almost half of pre-pandemic GDP in emerging market and developing economies. Second, already over the past decade, all fundamental drivers of growth, investment, productivity growth, improvements in education and health, working age population growth had slowed. These trends were expected to continue over the 2020s. Even without the pandemic, the average potential growth in emerging and developing economies was expected to slow from 5% during the past decade to 4% during the 2020s. But because of the pandemic, we are now expecting the average potential growth over the 2020s to decline further to around 3.3%. So, however you look at it, we are at a critical juncture today. The adverse effects of the pandemic on economic growth are sizable, but they can be reversed if policymakers do the right thing. Today, we will explore what can be done, put the global economy back on the quickest path to robust, sustainable, and equitable growth. I'm going to start the conversation with some warm-up questions on long-term growth prospects. Let me turn to Marie. Marie, our research has documented how potential growth, which is the foundation of lasting poverty reduction, was already decelerating prior to the pandemic. The pandemic is likely to cause a deeper slowdown in potential growth I just mentioned. What are the implications of these developments for achieving broader development goals? Marie?
Yes, thank you, Ayhan. Obviously, the JEP report analyzes this quite in depth. But just if we could just take the essence of your question and try to boil it down to a few major thoughts. I think the report is gloomy in the sense of outlining what lies ahead of us, 10 years of lost decade, if we don't address the major sources of this lower source of growth that has actually been worsened because of the pandemic. So I think you mentioned a few of them. It is really about getting back or transforming the investment growth path, because it was already slowing down before the pandemic, and the pandemic, as well as what's going to happen after, is actually showing a collapse in investment. So a big question is, how do we recover investment? Because that is key, obviously, to growth, to job creation, and so on. And I think the other big dimension is human capital. And these two have a very big impact on productivity. So the human capital losses, and there are many dimensions here, whether it's the learning losses or there's a gender dimension as well. How do we have policies that address these, both on the investment side as well as the human capital losses? And I would say that related to that is trade. I think this is my bias, because that's my background. Because if you looked at the analysis before the pandemic, trade was already slowing down also much more than ever before. It had not recovered before the pandemic, and now obviously it has collapsed even more. And so moving ahead, it's not unrelated to investment. Trade and investment as part of the recovery, which will require a lot of structural reforms. I think that's still sort of the standard development answer. But within that, because you mentioned sustainability, I think we're all also conscious about having the opportunity, when we're talking about transformative investments, to also find the opportunities for investments that are transformative, not just for growth and recovery and longer term development, but also that it addresses the climate crisis, it addresses the creation of jobs. And I would say, in the inclusiveness agenda, the other part of the story that we should also talk about is, the collapse that has happened due to the pandemic, the number of SMEs that have collapsed, the informal sector, and then the mid-sized corporations, the financial sector, so the private sector. How do we recover the private sector? Because they have to be an important participant and actor in our recovery moving forward. So there are policy issues within that. And of course, finally, the macro policies itself, the fiscal policies. Developing countries have little room to do the fiscal stimulus. They also have debt. They will be facing, or already facing, debt stress issues. So how do we also, either as the international community, as well as in countries, how do you address making sure there's enough fiscal space, and within that fiscal space, you use it effectively for the stimulus and for the right effective programs? So I probably should stop there because I think I would like to hear actually from the others.
Thank you, Marin. You covered quite a bit of ground and provided the transition to my question to Mesut. Mesut, in addition to its near-term health and economic effects, the pandemic appears on track to leave lasting scars through its disruption of fundamental drivers of long-term growth. And those drivers are, investment, education, health, you want labor force participation, among others. What would you suggest governments do to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on long-term growth in emerging and developing economies to continue make progress toward their development goals?
Thank you very much, Ayhan. And thank you also for this global economic prospects. I think you really come up with a very nice product in terms of looking at both the prospects and the risks. And Marie's just laid out the big agenda. And I want to say two things as, to add on to what she said. The first is that the most useful thing we can do to accelerate the return to long-term growth that is better is to contain the pandemic now. Because the longer the scarring, the deeper the scarring, the harder it will be to return to that growth path that we're talking about. So I think it's important to link the near-term and the long-term prospects because they are quite intertwined. That's my first point. The second thing is that in terms of the longer-term growth agenda, Marie laid out this sort of comprehensive framework of all the things that need to be done. And I would ask, within that, what are the things that are different now as a result of being in the post-COVID world? So the post-COVID world isn't going to be the same as the world that existed before, and it will require us to reallocate resources from some activities that we thought were economically viable, socially useful, to other things which are now going to be more viable. And the pace at which economies are able to shift resources from what used to be viable to what is going to be viable is going to be very important in differentiating the winners from the laggards going forward. And in doing that, I would say the role of the financial sector is going to be very important. We haven't yet seen the consequences of the deterioration of corporate balance sheets on bank balance sheets. And if you fast forward next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of banks under stress in emerging markets in developing countries. We know from history that we are very slow at addressing emerging problems in the banking sector. It takes us 2 or 3 rounds of bank restructuring before we get it right. And the more proactive we can be in identifying and dealing with the need to reallocate stranded assets, lost assets in the banking sector, move it out to where it's going to be really profitable is going to be very important. Last thing I'll say, this is not going to be just a technical conversation. It's an intensely political discussion. And for many governments, the populations are already quite tired as a result of a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And for emerging markets and developing countries, we're not at the end of this crisis. We've got another year at least. So for emerging market, developing country governments, they are going to have to be very judicious in which reforms they push, because the appetite for broad-based reforms will be quite limited in populations, and also how they can make a case for them that is politically appealing for the population, which has to then undergo some more near-term cost or long-term gain. So I just want to kind of also bring in the political economy dimension into this conversation. So let me stop with that, Ayhan.
Thank you, Mesut. That's fantastic. These financial sector issues are exactly the type of issues we are discussing at the bank pretty much every day, on the weekends included. The meetings are taking place. We are worried about these stresses coming down the road. Priorities going to be critical. Policymakers need to define the priorities very carefully. Let me turn to Laura. Laura, you worked on productivity issues. What do you think about the long-term impacts of the pandemic on productivity? We always talked about this, basically big changes in productivity. Productivity is increasing because of the digital technologies. Are we going to see them? How does the potential for productivity gains compare to the substantial losses from long periods of separation from the labor market, from many workers, disruptions associated with education? So there are big questions there, but we know that without productivity, you cannot have sustained growth. What do you think?
First, thanks, Ayhan, for the invitation, and also congratulations. I know everyone has said it, but it's a great report. And in general, I want to congratulate the World Bank. I have been using your reports through this pandemic, and I do congratulate you because you have done amazing work in complicated times. I'm probably going to be very repetitive. But let me start by acknowledging what we know. This crisis is not over. In fact, your chief economist, Carmen Reinhardt, said it in a talk I was part of last week. There's still many uncertainties. There is hope because we have a lot of vaccines, but we have seen that distribution, logistics are not trivial. Even in Massachusetts, which I think has a great governor who's very pragmatic and he executes, there has been delays. But again, there is hope, but we do need to worry. This is not over. It's going to take time. Even if we could do this efficiently, providing vaccines to 8 billion people, by definition, is going to take time in terms of production and distribution. We still don't know about mutations. We still don't know about long-term effects. So I don't think this has already been a short-term shock. We still have at least 1 year, 2 years to go, depending where you are. And as Masood said, there are going to be some lasting changes related to this pandemic. But let me go before the pandemic time. At least the emerging markets that I know better, Latin America, we were not catching up. And we were not catching up due to productivity problems. We were not using our resources, capital, and labor efficiently. We were not investing in capital. We were not investing in human capital. I tend to use examples of my country so no one feels affected. But even in my country, Costa Rica, in the last 6 years, in the PISA exams, we have been lagging in math. On top of that, add that kids have not been to school for in the case of Costa Rica, actually 2 years before, because of a previous strike. My mom was a principal. She knew that when kids wouldn't come to school 1, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, she needed to start calling to find out what's going on. We send them all home. In Latin America, I just think there are very few countries that have done an effort to bring them back. So we're going to have a serious medium long-term problem. As we also know, this is a very regressive regression. It's a regression that has affected people that don't have human capital. Again, people who don't know how to use the computer, people that don't have access. In many countries in the region, we have lagged in internet access. This is not people having a phone. Everyone has a phone, but people don't have high-speed broadband. Again, even in the case of Costa Rica, we had the money to do it. We didn't do it. So all the things we didn't do before the crisis are coming back to haunt us in big time. And so the things we needed to do before, we need to do now. As Masood said, we need to understand the political economy of why didn't do the reforms that we needed to do before. And so right now, I worry more about reallocation effects than this loss of human capital. After 2 years, if you don't go back to your job, the human capital depreciates. We need to reallocate. Businesses, and I mean private sector, also government, that do not have an online strategy are not going to be able to survive this crisis, but also the world after that. I don't think it's going to be as bad as the world we had before. I for one, I'm one that needs to get out of the house. I'm dying in my house. I hate my house by now. I cannot see the same walls. There is going to be a need on human interaction. I do believe kids need to go back to school. I don't believe in kids being able to efficiently learn online. even if they have the Wi-Fi, even they have the computer. But we cannot deny that some of these changes are here to stay. So firms, organizations, governments need a long line strategy. And I worry more about this lack of reallocation, reorganization, than the loss of matches. I am not one that believes we should save every job, we should save every organization. We need to think how to do that. And I think we need to do it, as I said, now, because the businesses that are going to be able to survive later are the ones that are doing the changes now. So we need to think, the international organizations, policymakers, and academia, how we start helping countries without increasing the costs of the pandemic. And again, these are things we should have done before. So the incentives are aligned.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. So we are discussing how we can reverse the scars of the pandemic with three distinguished panelists, experts on policy making, and I am going to turn to the second topic we want to discuss today: new policy priorities. Mesut, you already talked about the importance of defining priorities. As you know, many have called the fiscal stimulus to tackle the pandemic as an opportunity for green investment. There are many types of green investment, of course, and many purposes. In your view, what green investment would be money well spent to ensure sustainable growth over the next decade?
That's a very good question, Ayhan, precisely in the way you formulated it, because there are many green investments. And there are two things that recently, I've become more conscious of in this area. One is, if you look at the range of unit costs on mitigation investments that are being undertaken in developing countries around the world, first of all, data on them is not so easy to come by as to what the unit costs are, and I think that in itself is an issue. But secondly, the range varies from a lot of projects where it costs between $10 and $20 a ton per ton of carbon dioxide averted, to over $100,000, $500,000. So I think one thing we have to do is just get very rigorous about looking at the cost effectiveness of investments that we are going to make as we all scale up our investments in climate mitigation. There are lots of good, high value, high rate of return investments that we need to be focusing on. The second thing I want to say is that if you're a low income country, the 50 poorest countries that have a fifth of the world's population account for less than 2% of global emissions. Their main problem is adapting to climate change. And that's why I think it's really important, as we think about green investments, to think about adaptation and helping those countries deal with what is coming down the road. And there are many profitable opportunities to be had. And in a way, I'm very happy that the World Bank, when you talk about expanding your work on climate, you've made it very clear that for you, adaptation is going to be a big part of that agenda, because for low-income countries, that is going to be a big issue going forward. And finally, let me end on one point, which there's a lot of debate going on about whether ODA, development assistance, official aid, should be used for climate mitigation or not, and what are the pros and cons of it. And I don't want to get into the big debate here, but just to give you one number, ODA is $150 billion globally. Even if it was all reallocated to mitigation, it is a fraction of the cost of what the world needs to spend on mitigation. So ODA is not going to solve the climate finance problem. And the world as a whole, I think, needs to recognize that they will have to provide resources for climate finance, which recognize that this is a global public good with its own responsibilities and challenges.
Thank you, Mesut. Yes, development aid is not the cure when we think about huge climate-related challenges, especially in low-income countries. And of course, with the kind of the intensified effort on climate issues, the bank is going to play the kind of its role, facilitate and help these economies as much as possible. I'm going to turn to Laura very quickly. Laura, you made a passionate case for policymakers to be proactive in Latin America. And we know that Latin America has this enduring challenge. Informality is rampant, and it is also a challenge, it impedes development. These informal firms have been hit very hard by the mitigation measures imposed over the past year to slow the spread of the virus. How do you see informal firms recovering from this shock? Are there specific support measures that policymakers can implement to help informal sectors even after the pandemic eases? Are there any suggestions in the case of Latin America as well?
So thanks. I think it's interesting that again, I'm talking about many countries in Latin America. When the pandemic started, we just went and copied things that were being done in other countries without understanding or realizing that economic structures are very different not only in the composition of services, manufacturing, and agriculture, but mostly in terms of the type of firms. We tend to be dominated by informal and tiny firms. Latin America, for example, is close to 60%. This is the case in Colombia. That it's a paper a country I've been analyzing with more detailed data. It's also the case in Costa Rica that was close to 50% even before the crisis. And we know from data now that they were disproportionately affected by the lockdowns, because a lot of this informality is part of the ecosystem. As people were forced to stay home, a lot of these networks were not there. But also affected a lot the compliance with the lockdown. Again, this informality is also associated with lower quality jobs, lower income jobs. So again, a need to try to find something to do to feed the family. So let me stress that 60% of the jobs tend to be informal, but they are lower quality jobs. Value added is less than half of that. So we need to think in the recovery, perhaps not to overburden formality. We need to increase the formal sector for many reasons, not only because of the value added, because also of the benefits in terms of social safety nets and so on. And again, an example of something Costa Rica has proposed, they have proposed a tax on financial transactions. This is the opposite of what we should be doing. That kills formality. We need to keep jobs formal. We need to keep financial sector access. So again, when we think of how to deal with the recovery, we need to pay attention to formal jobs and how to bring people that are in the formal sector into the formal sector. As I said, a lot of the adjustment has a fixed cost, and that does mean that very small firms may not be able to deal with the jobs. I don't think we need to be that scared of larger firms. They were able to deal with some of the costs because of the fixed cost. But I'm also hopeful. Brazil is an example in the 2000s that they increased formality. There was a huge growth of formality by reducing a lot of the burden, but also doing many things to bring firms into formal sectors. So there are good cases we can follow, and I think we should strive to do that. Sorry if I took longer than I should.
Thank you, Laura. This is great, and I think I'm happy to hear some good cases of policy making. Given the challenges we see around the world. Let me turn to Marie. Marie, I am worried now. I think that these problems Laura and Mesut were talking about eventually would require the bank to be even more active. And it means we need to be, speed up as we are gearing for the spring meetings. We discussed before, the pandemic has hit some of the vulnerable groups the hardest. Of course, among them, women. Since women are disproportionately employed in services sectors, they have been hit by job losses. And we know from past crises that girls tend to drop out disproportionately when schooling is disrupted. Of course, that has happened massive scale. What do developing countries need to do to boost female labor force participation, because that's one way of basically elevating potential output in these economies. Marie?
Yes, thanks, Ayhan. I think you've picked one of the most important issues for me in this crisis. How do we address the differential impact it has had on women, and also probably see it also as an opportunity for increasing female labor force participation, which has been, a major development issue for some time. And to pick up on Masood's theme about what you do now is, should be seen as also the longer term agenda. So in responding to the issues that have hit women in this pandemic, we are also thinking forward in terms of increasing female labor force participation, which will then contribute to productivity, growth, and so on and so forth. As we all know, women have been more affected by the pandemic because they tend to be in the services sector, which have had the highest job losses. They're also the ones in the front line in health with healthcare workers, and they're the ones that end up having to stay home with lockdown to take care of children, take care of parents, and so on. And therefore, I think in the short term, what needs the focus of our response, emergency response policies has been, one more thing that has happened that we saw the data, which is really, something that's not, we had not wanted this to happen, but the increase in gender-based violence is another aspect of this pandemic. And under lockdown, it's been increasing. So in the short term, you need to find solutions for social protection that are geared towards women, access to childcare, assistance for education from home. How do women get help to help children who are at home receiving education from home, and protection from domestic violence. And in the Cash for Work program, or in the social protection program, or even in the food assistance programs, how do we make sure that women are being paid attention to? Because we do household survey data, as you know, the Pulse household survey data that we've been doing is showing that people are eating less, and women and children are disproportionately more affected, for instance. So and this is obviously going to have a big impact on human capital. And in the recovery phase, how do we make sure that women can recover their job, can recover their entrepreneurship opportunities? Because a lot of women are in the informal sector. How do we empower women to, whether it's the finance part or whether it's getting more digital skills? How do we make sure they can be addressed? And Cash for Work program, I struggled with this when I was a minister. The Cash for Work program tend to be infrastructure related, which are not really catered for women. So we need to design Cash for Work programs that are catering for jobs created for women, and getting girls back to school. I think that's really, really crucial. The experience of the Ebola crisis actually showed that girls were 16% more a chance of not going back to school. So I think in the kind of going back to school, making sure that schools open up safely and getting kids back to school, we have to really ensure that girls get back to school. And the final thing I would say is that actually we just released our Women, Business and Law 2021 report. And there the issue is really about the types of regulations, and this is not just laws, but also religious and customary laws that need to be changed to ensure that women have equal opportunity for jobs, gender wage gap, and also the entrepreneur equal access to become entrepreneurs. So there's actually, thankfully, there was a progress there that countries have actually made some progress on eliminating job restrictions and gender wage gaps, as well as passing laws relative to marriage and parenthood, or removing restrictions on women's entrepreneurship. For instance, in my own country, early child marriage is an issue for women, for labor force participation. So I think these are sort of a big gamut of issues. But let's see, let's hope that there is an opportunity in the response to design policies that really address these basic issues with regard to ensuring that we can have a greater women, a female labor force participation.
Thank you, Marie. It's obvious these issues we have discussed so far, they were there before the pandemic, and they are now magnified because of the pandemic, and the policy responses have become urgent. But it is impossible to think about policy without thinking about fiscal issues. So now we are going to turn to fiscal policy challenges. If you are joining us today, we are discussing how we can reverse the scars of the pandemic with our three distinguished guests, Laura Alfaro, Marie Pangastu, and Mesut Ahmed. Laura, I'm going to turn to you. You worked on these issues quite a bit. As you know, over the past decade, there has been a major shift in the composition of debt in emerging and developing economies, with a rise in non-Paris Club creditors. So how does this trend affect debt sustainability and the provision of debt relief going forward? You are muted, Laura.
Let me just add to what Marie just said, just because I do think this is important. I think we need to teach girls math. We need to get girls into IT, science, STEM, so on and so forth. And we need to bring kids back to school. And there are safe ways to do it. I'm not saying there are no risks, but there are safe ways to do it. And we need to put all of us an effort to do that, because I think this is creating too many problems, including women not being able to work. But now we also go to another important problem, which is the fiscal. And as you said, this has been particularly complicated for emerging markets because we didn't have fiscal space before. Let me say that we didn't have fiscal space before, not for many reasons, but also not all the spending we were doing before was great spending. So I do think that there might be some room again for reallocation of that spending. It's a political economy issue, but we can do better in terms of the space we already have. Having said that, as you said, for many reasons, we now have a greater credit from non-Paris Club members. And I think the World Bank has been right here. We need transparency. We cannot pardon someone's debt so that the money, which is fungible, goes either into capital flight, many times associated with corruption, so on and so forth, or to pay some other lenders. So there has to be an effort to call for transparency. I think this will benefit everyone, not only in terms of the different creditors, but as I said, the allocation of resources. I think we can do better in terms of what we're doing. Having said that, as you know, many emerging markets have not been so keen on some of these proposals because they worry that the effort they have done to access international financial markets may be lost. Also, there's record low interest rates, so they also don't have to. So we need to think again how we're going to design all of these global incentives so that we can get countries to invest and allocate better, and also think of the cost benefits of the money they're getting from different actors. What I do worry is that we're going to go into a very low productivity and low growth world, and that debt levels are high. So we may not see the problems right now, but we're going to see them in the medium term.
Thank you, Laura. So you describe a very difficult future ahead of us. Weak growth, elevated debt levels. Let me turn to Marie. Marie, I don't know how many meetings you and I have been to discussing debt issues and what to do. But there is a big crowd out there. They basically say, interest rates are so low. Why do you worry about these high debt levels? Countries should be able to continue borrowing, and given that the interest rates are low, they should be able to pay back. What is our answer to that question, Marie?
Well, first that, I think low interest rates are sort of maybe clouding the basic insolvency problems that countries face. And that's what we need to address, because at some point the interest rates will go back up. Maybe this time it will take longer than before, but it will come back up. And people are now talking with the U.S. stimulus program, the interest rates, they could be inflationary impact, and therefore the interest rates would go back up. And I think for countries like Indonesia during the global financial crisis, we actually saw that we benefited from that low negative interest rate, and there was a lot of capital outflow coming to the emerging markets looking for higher returns. But the moment there was a signal of interest rates going up, capital outflow. So I think this is a lesson learned that, apart from your own debt profile and looking at the low interest rates, and getting hot capital coming in because of the low interest rate environment, how do you manage that? And that at the end of the day is about your own macro and debt sustainability and sound fiscal policy programs, right? So you should not be what do you call it? Be fooled by the low interest rate environment. The fundamentals are still going to be important, and here is where I guess debt transparency is an important issue, and the ability for countries to really do debt restructuring. So to get out of the debt overhang and be able to restructure their debt so that they can have the fiscal space to recover. And this is a lot of what we're doing, so that it is an urgent issue. It's not something that we can delay just because we think interest rates are going to be low, and countries can go to get money, get funding from the capital market.
Thank you, Maria. I think the key sentence there, we shouldn't be fooled by low interest rates. Interest rates might be low, but it might not be low for specific countries. And we have seen that many times in the past. And if there is one person who can say, I have seen this movie before, that's Masood, because he worked on the HIPIC initiative in the late 90s. Masood, you have been following the developments. Obviously, the global community is taking some initial steps toward debt relief. A number of low-income countries are facing very serious debt problems. Some of them already in high debt distress. Some of them realize that they cannot manage. So we have the debt service suspension initiative and this new initiative, G20 Common Framework. How effective have these policies been, and what other policy responses do you think will be needed in coming years? You have been there, you have done it. Do you see that these measures good enough to address the problem we have nowadays?
Thanks, Ayhan. So the first point, just to reiterate something that Marie said, interest rates are low, but they're not low for everyone. And if you look at low-income countries, and we're talking about them, they're not getting low interest rates in the market right now. And for many of them, the market is not a viable option. So that's one point. Now, on the DSSI, which was a way to suspend the debt service payments by about 45 of the poorest countries through the end of 2020, now extended through to the middle of 2021. That's been a helpful instrument. It's provided about $5 billion of debt service relief to these countries last year. That's about half of what was expected, mainly because some of the official creditors, and mostly people talk to some Chinese financial institutions, have not participated as people had thought that they would, and also because the private sector really has not participated at all. And I think that during this year, I don't anticipate that we'll see a change in the fact that the private sector is going to be largely out of it. And the private sector is important for many of these countries because of the historical that they hold. The second instrument now is this common framework. Common framework is an advance. It's an advance in part because it brings more systematically the non-Paris Club creditors that Laura was talking about, and that's again mainly but not only China, into the discussion of debt much more centrally. It's also an advance because it recognizes that simply putting a halt on debt service payments for a few months or a year isn't dealing with the problems of insolvency. And so you have to, in some countries, look at debt reduction, which is to actually reduce the amount of debt stock through various measures. And you remember, you referred to HIPC. I don't think we'll see another HIPC in that. I don't anticipate we'll see a wave of countries being dealt with in a common framework in the same way. But we will see numerous countries over the next year or two coming in for dealing with what is an unsustainable level of debt that they are now carrying. Everybody, all creditors will have to take a hit. Now, for the multilaterals, and I want to end on this point, for the MDBs and the World Bank, I mean, you are contributing by providing new money to these countries at a time when they need it most. And, you know, you've had a big increase in lending last year. And I think that the way to help these countries as they sort out their debt problems with some of their creditors is to continue to support them with new money over the course of the next 3 or 4 years at similarly elevated levels as we've seen last year. But on debt, I do feel that the next year is the test of seeing whether the common framework, which looks great when you look at it from 30,000 feet, you bring it down to 5,000 feet and look at the details, whether it will actually deliver on the promise that people have of it. And I think there's every reason to think it can, but it won't do it unless everyone comes together to solve the problem.
Indeed, Masood, policy prescriptions, frameworks are always good, but it boils down to implementation, and we need to see whether common framework is going to deliver. Of course, at the World Bank, we are working these issues 24/7, trying to think solutions. And I'm hoping that we are going to have a robust discussion going forward on these, especially at the spring meetings. Let me thank you again, Marie, Laura, and Masood. This is fantastic discussion for your insights. We have a few minutes for questions from our online audience. We have hundreds of people are watching. If you are joining, we are discussing how we can reverse the scars of the pandemic with Laura Alfaro of Harvard University, Masood Ahmed of Center for Global Development, and Marie Pangestu of the World Bank. So let me start with Laura. So you know the Latin America well, and obviously the region had, however you look at it, historical recession last year. When we think about the Latin America region, we also, think about why this region hasn't been integrating into the world economy through trade in the way we have seen, for example, in East Asia. So that has been a challenge, and I think it's going to remain as a challenge going forward. But is this the right time to think about for the region? It is an approach to trade. What steps could be taken, either at the firm level or through policy challenges, to boost the region's participation in global trade, global value chains? What do you think, Laura?
Thanks. That's a complex question. Part of the lack of integration in Latin America has been a lot of political economy, and we clearly don't have time to get into that. Different policies, ideologies of import substitution. Again, many failed. I come from a small open economy. Like we just do need the global economy. It might be a little bit different for a country like the size of Brazil. Again, Latin America has a lot of heterogeneity. But in the shorter term, we do know that the world economy shifts into more protection. This is even before the pandemic. A lot of firms have been rethinking their global value chain strategies, worried about hyper specialization, extreme reliance to a country, And also, as we know, the trade wars. It is possible now that in the US, we will get less policy via Twitter, but we do know that there has been a shift that is unlikely to go back, at least in the short run. Already President Biden announced a Buy America policy. In Europe, we also have an announcement that vaccines should be through Europeans. In fact, I have done some research that in terms of medical equipment and vaccines, people do support more local production. So it is a complex time to think about that. But as I said, for the smaller countries in the region, there's no other way to go. I would argue that even for the bigger countries, it will allow them to improve this lack of productivity. And again, there's a lot of political economy of why it hasn't been done, but it also is aligned with the productivity agenda. We need better infrastructure. We need better education. We need lower regulation. We need more formality. So we need to think deep about the political economy and all the policies that we're doing at the global level. We need to think how we help that political economy to push those reforms, because they are aligned in terms of improving access to global markets as well.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to stick to these questions we collected earlier today, and now questions are coming in online. There are a number of questions about the regional dimensions of the crisis. So, Masood, you were in charge of Middle East and Central Asia region in the IMF. That was your, I think, last assignment. And you know, these economies are heavily reliant on oil as a source of export and government revenues. So during the pandemic, they didn't just have one shock, actually. They had this double whammy, the oil price collapse as well. What can these economies do to better diversify, to avoid the risks posed from reliance on a single commodity? This is, I think, a kind of an enduring question, but it really made a huge difference during this devastating event.
It's a challenge that the oil exporting countries in the Middle East have been trying to address for 2 decades. If you look at it, every oil exporting country has a plan and a strategy for diversifying away from reliance on oil. And the success on this has been quite mixed so far, I would say. Mostly countries have fallen short of what they hoped they would achieve. There are countries like in the UAE, the Dubai, which is the most diversified. Bahrain has been diversified, but these are small economies. The larger ones have had more difficulty. And I would say, in 2 words, this is a big topic, and even people in the World Bank have written big books about this, but if I want to just summarize it, I would say diversification, which really means creating a viable, competitive, non-oil-based economy, is very hard to achieve if you think of it as a project that doesn't touch your economy that is public sector oil-based. So unless you are willing to make big changes in the way in which you put incentives, relative wages, relative salaries between the public sector and the private sector, and you're willing to change the way you think about your whole economy, not think of it as a separate project. I'm going to create a little, diversified non-oil economy. It's going to be very hard to achieve. And the second thing is that it's not really about big mega projects. Diversification is not going to be achieved successfully through large mega projects. It's about creating a whole infrastructure of small and medium enterprises, of small businesses as well. And that's where the service sector becomes important. That's where bringing women into the labor force. This is something that both Marie and Laura mentioned. The Middle East and North Africa lags behind most regions in terms of female participation in the labor force. Bringing them in more, changing the rules and the frameworks for female participation in the labor force will be a big part of having a viable, vibrant service sector there.
Thank you, Masood. I think between the pandemic, the oil price collapse, and the climate challenges, there is no way to, avoid this challenge, and countries that rely heavily on oil need to find ways to basically diversify. How they are going to do that, it's going to be a challenge. Of course, we at the World Bank working with them to find durable solutions. Let me turn to Marie. Marie, at the bank, we have been discussing intensively how to help low-income countries, the IDA countries, countries that are basically members of International Development Association. These countries have been hit hard and at the end experienced a reversal, years of progress at poverty alleviation. So based on the discussions we have, how do you see these countries can be helped? What the policymakers should do?
Yeah, you're absolutely right there, because obviously they are being the hardest hit, and they will be experiencing a sharp drop in their per capita incomes. And I think the JEP makes a prediction, or we have been making predictions, that we're losing about at the minimum 5 years of development gains that have already been achieved during the past decade. So you have to recoup what's lost, and then also address the current issues with the pandemic. And as you know, what we've been trying to do is several things. First of all is obviously front load our assistance to these countries, and working with the governments to really focus on what are the important issues. And we focus on the health emergency response, as well as the social protection response. So on the health response, I think we've come in over 100, I think it's 114 countries, to come in and help them really set up the healthcare systems. And again, this is going to Masood's point about what we do in the short term needs to also be thinking about the medium term. How do you do that and at the same time think about building out a better healthcare system? And of course, most importantly now is the vaccine distribution. And we are accelerating our work on that. We have been working on this very intensively. Our teams have been working intensively on this to ensure that there's equitable vaccine distribution, whether it's through the COVAX facility, which is hopefully can guarantee 20% to all the AMC 92 countries, which are all the IDA countries. And we are providing any financing that could be needed, as well as, most importantly, helping the countries to be prepared to have the infrastructure, the training of the workers, the communication strategy, to be able to roll out the vaccines. So we are working both on the procurement as well as on the vaccination side. And this has been, I think our teams have been working flat out since November, December to now to really have that ready, because this is really the crucial part about being able to recover the growth, to respond and recover, begin to recover. Because otherwise, as has been the case in other pandemics, the least developed countries are the last to get the vaccines, and therefore the last to recover, to have any sources of growth, and therefore the longer they will have in terms of having to recoup the development losses. And then on the social protection, obviously we have the direct cash transfers to the poor, but we also need to, I think we're learning a lot during this crisis in terms of how to make the cash transfer programs more adaptable to country situations. In some cases, it's better to give them direct food assistance, because food insecurity has become a huge problem for the least developed countries. Some of them are being hit by natural disasters like flood or locust attack and so on. So we have to really look at each country to see what is the type of social protection that is best needed for these countries on the ground. And we are working very closely with many UN partners and CSOs on the ground to make sure that we reach the vulnerable population, and this includes refugees and displaced people and so on. So I think this is really our short-term program, and as Laura was also emphasizing, this is going to be an important part of the program, and I hope that we can continue to work with governments on that. 2022 is going to be a big challenge because it's a resource constraint issue, both for the bank as well as for the countries in question. But we can have another conversation on that.
Thank you, Marie. Let me quickly summarize. The challenges are there, and it's not going to be easy to reverse the scars of this pandemic. There's this health crisis. It turned into an economic crisis. And we just need to make sure it doesn't turn into a serious financial crisis. There are immediate issues in terms of distribution, immunization of vaccines, and making sure that we have these mitigation measures in place while we are transitioning to a normal, whatever that normal is. These medium long-term challenges will require determination, defining priorities, thinking outside of the box, and finding ways to use the limited resources effectively. At the same time, addressing the other big challenges, including climate change. Whatever we do, global cooperation is going to be critical. The bank will be there working with our members to find durable solutions to basically help our members to reach the kind of the development goals they set. Let me thank you to Marie, Laura, and Masood. This has been a fantastic conversation, and everyone who tuned in today. Please share this conversation with your colleagues, friends, and followers on social media. We have an extensive collection of studies on our webpage. Please come and visit. A recording of this event will be available on World Bank Live. Thank you for your participation and stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye.
So